So we're ready to start, and let me try something here. See if this works. I'm gonna see if I can get a poll here. I go with a poll about what you're looking to get out of this session. So we're gonna start out that way with just a poll, and the options are specific problem, career advice, soft skill advice, or technical advice. I'm going to go ahead and start the poll. All right, we have a poll. And let's see, does it come up in the chat here? If you're able to see the poll, go ahead and take it and we'll see what happens here. Yeah, all right. Thanks for taking that. Yes, a specific problem. Oh, great. Do I use AS for shorthand to make it simpler? Oh, yes. We're talking about SQL. Great question. Yeah. All right. How about this? Let's actually go into SQL Server Management Studio. It's an example of one code editor we could use. And we will copy that over and just have a discussion about as. Great question. That can get confusing very quickly. I originally learned SQL coding without the as. I guess whoever I learned it from realized it wasn't necessary, and so they would leave off the as. And so when I started seeing as, it was kind of confusing. I think more often than not, I see as being used in the select statement, although it's not needed there either. And then I don't see it typically in the from statement or the join statement where you're joining tables together and you're aliasing tables. A lot of times I think more people tend to drop the as in the from and join statements, but I typically do see it most of the time in the select statement. That's just been my experience. But what we'll do here is just kind of copy your code over here and talk through it. And I'm excited to try for the first time the scene selection feature here. The stream software I'm using. So here we go. We are going to share the screen. All right, hopefully that looks okay. Yeah, so you've got a table right here, an invoice table. You're aliasing that invoice table as I. Hey, that right there, that is a good practice. Sometimes I get a little lazy and I'll just call the first table in the from statement A and then maybe the second one B and so forth. And it's really helpful if it has some kind of a link, some kind of a connection, the alias you use compared to the table. So in this case, you're using I because the invoice table starts with I. That's great. And then interjoining the customer table, and you're giving the customer table an alias of C because it starts with C. Perfect. Then you've got your on statement, and yeah, customer ID equals customer ID. Looks like a great join to me. And to your point, you can use as here. You're being very explicit here. Not a bad thing. I think more often than not, I tend to see, again, in the from statement and join statement, I'd see it written without the as. And it's very interesting. It makes you wonder what the purpose of as is in the first place when you can actually get away with not writing it there. But I guess it makes it clear that you're aliasing it when you say, okay, this table is going to be called as I or C. Again, what I tend to see more often is in the select statement when you're renaming a variable or naming a variable that's being created, which is if you're going to create a variable, you really want to have you want to give it an alias so it's not just going to have a random name in the output. But you might be selecting invoice number from your I table, from your invoice table, and And that's why you give it an alias in the first place, right? Because so you don't have to spell out here, you don't have to spell out invoice, you can just use the alias that you've given to it. So it's shorthand there, it's shorthand in the on statement as well. But then you're going to maybe rename this, maybe something more user-friendly. A lot of people use underscores throughout their whole analysis, even when you take this SQL query into something like Power BI. But you can, I like to, instead of using underscores, as quickly as possible, get in a form that I can actually write, it looks good in a visualization platform, or even if you're copying the results to Excel, it's got the spacing and it's got the right capitalization. So for instance, here, and if you're going to do that, you either need to put it in brackets like this, or you can put double quotes around it. That's key, double quotes around it instead of single quotes. You use single quotes when you're referencing a value, like to filter on something. Double quotes to kind of say this, what I'm about to name is a variable, and so don't don't skip over the space here. This is all one thing within the quotes. This is all one variable name. So I'm renaming here. Now technically, you could do this where you don't have that as statement. I see that sometimes. I see some users doing that. But again, I think most of the time I see as being used in the select statement. And then I don't see it as much being used in the join statement. That's just my experience. So yeah, you can, whether it's in the select statement, whether it's in the join statement, you can include an as right before you alias something, or you cannot. Either way works. So that's a good topic. I suppose if you really wanted to be formal about it and write it out, you could use as in both places. All right, let's see if we have any more topics now. Did that answer your question, Tiffany? Absolutely, I've seen it done both ways. It's definitely up to you. That's an interesting one. All right, that was a great question to open us up. I'll go back to the main screen here. I'm going to get really good at switching between these. Here I am. All right. Just to talk about the format for the office hours, help you know what to expect for this session going forward. This is a time for you to ask questions. Again, I wish it was a little more interactive where I could see your camera and we could just have a conversation. The way it's set up is you kind of interact through comments. So if you have questions, leave a comment and we're going to go through your questions. And then if we get all through those, I will have a prepared topic. I have a prepared topic today if there's time for it. But I want to answer your questions first. So what kind of questions are we talking about? Well, you might have a burning technical question. Now, if it's really complex, you probably do need to have that more interactive video chat. Something a little more interactive than a chat is probably nice. But you can try as much as possible to use the comment section. I'll try to understand it and do my best to help you. But if you have a specific challenge, hey, I'm not sure how to do this in Power BI or Excel or Python, or maybe you're working on a data science model, SQL, bring that challenge. Talk to us about it in the chat, and we'll try to help you as much as possible. So helping you to troubleshoot is one purpose of an event like this. But it also can encompass just general advice. I'm trying to learn analytics. Where should I start? I am running into this situation at work. It could be an analytics challenge. It could be just I'm about to build this model. This is kind of the high-level use case. How would you approach this? Now, whether it's putting data in the chat or talking about something really sensitive for your organization, don't do that. Don't put anything that you wouldn't be comfortable with having published to the world. These office hours are going to be published, and so you don't want to put anything too sensitive in here. All right, be very mindful of that. Now, if you'll have to make the judgment call, but if you can kind of generalize it a little bit, and then put it in the chat, that could work. So keep that in mind. This will be published, so don't put anything sensitive in there. But you might also be looking for career advice. Again, whether you're an aspiring analyst trying to get your next role, or already in an analytics role, you're an analytics professional and you're trying to advance to the next level or be successful in your role, we can talk about some different tactics for that. So really, the sky's the limit. Ask all kinds of questions. However I can help, that's what this is here for. And I've got Python, I've got SQL Server Management Studio ready to go, as you just saw, Power BI ready to go, Excel ready to go. I have a couple of different data sets too that we can use if you want to see a concept illustrated. And of course, a web browser if I don't know the answer. And that in itself can kind of be interesting because it's really important to be able to troubleshoot quickly, to figure out what resources are out there to help you, and again, to do that quickly. So there's some, I think, just naturally as we troubleshoot, we realize what types of links are helpful and which ones aren't, and where to look, and kind of skip the irrelevant information. So I'll try to talk through that if I do run into a situation where I'm having to look it up on the spot. I just want to help you, and so if I need to look it up, I'll try to do that as well. There'll probably be situations where I just don't know, and I'll try to let you know that I don't know and provide as much information as I can. But I'm really, excited to get to collaborate in this way. It's a start anyway, right? Again, it's not ideal. I can't see your video, can't hear you, but at least there's the message, and we can kind of go back and forth. Again, got a prepared topic today. We'll have a few polls throughout this as well. Let's see. Let me see if I have any more comments here to go through. That's the end of my intro spiel here. All right. Looks like Tiffany. Yeah. All right. Can you go over some DAX and Power BI? Absolutely. Any DAX in particular? Anything in particular that you want to go over? I'll go ahead and open up Power BI here. One of the reasons people like Power BI so much, one, it's very affordable. If your organization is already buying E5 licenses for your employees, and a lot of organizations do that, gives you kind of access to most of the Microsoft suite, you already have access to Power BI. There's no incremental cost. Your company is essentially already paying for it through the E5 license. Those aren't necessarily cheap. But if they're already paying for that for the other Microsoft products, why not use Power BI? There's no incremental cost, and they have added in so much functionality on a monthly basis. It's just a great tool. I'm a really big fan. So Power BI is great. It's also familiar for those that have used Excel in the past. DAX formulas tend to be really similar to Excel formulas, so that's maybe another nice feature. All right. Time. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot we could do related to time. So maybe extracting date parts or something like that, for instance, or something different related to time. And I'll share my screen here soon. But as much details as you like, just let me know what kind of thing you're looking to look at related to time, and we'll dive in. Just getting it set up here. I think I can probably use the college football data set for this one. It's always interesting. Okay, we're going over to Power BI. Here we are. Just imported this via Excel for now. Normally we'd be importing via database so that we can schedule it to refresh easily. Data's always fresh. This is a college football data set starting 1992 through probably about a month ago, I think is when I refreshed it. Pulled via Python API. It's one row per college football game. It's got your Division I games, and then they've started to sprinkle in some of your other divisions in recent years. So really it's through 1992 for your Division I, and then maybe starting in 5 years ago they might have added Division 2 and 3 is what I've noticed. All right, so we'll load this in. Now I will say, again, I like to import data via SQL. Another reason for that, outside of the refresh, making the refresh easy, is it tends to be really easy to manipulate data in SQL. I think it's one of the most flexible tools for data manipulation, getting your table in the right format, the right rows, the right columns, creating additional columns, joining tables together. I think it's one of the most flexible tools for that compared to anything else. Python, R, SAS, Power BI, Tableau. SQL is just an analytic staple that is so flexible. And it probably is my familiarity with SQL as well. I've been using it for 13 years, so I'm very comfortable with it as well. But a lot of people use SQL, a lot of analysts. It's one of the most popular tools out there. So I would do a lot of my date manipulation within SQL before I'm even bringing in the data. I'd write those, if I'm doing a date difference, for instance, or maybe a date add to add some days to a particular date. I do as much of that in SQL as possible. Now, where you need to kind of use Power BI and DAX, where it really makes sense, is aggregations. You can't necessarily do your aggregations in SQL always. You want to do those in Power BI because if there's something like a weighted average, doing your aggregations in your SQL query and then kind of taking the average of an average doesn't really work, right? It's not a weighted average at that point. So sometimes you need to do data manipulation in Power BI, again, especially for aggregation type work. But outside of that, I prefer to do as much as possible beforehand in my SQL query, or maybe if it started with a Python job in Python. All right, so we've got our data set here. Let's see, I'm going to go into this and maybe just show, let's create a new, so first thing we'll do in DAX, and I recommend going to the triple dots next to your table and then saying new measure, and we're just going to do a count of games. Number of games equals count. We could count any field, but if we really want a good count of games, we need to count a field that is always populated. So I think it's probably fair to assume that all of your home team's always populated. So if there were any of these, maybe like city state, where sometimes it's null, it would only be counting the non-null values, similar to how count works in SQL. So keep that in mind if you ever use the count operator, but count is an aggregation operation. And I think one thing that can confuse people when they're getting started with Power BI is the difference between columns and measures. The high level difference here is columns are things that are at the row level, measures are things that are at the aggregation level. So if you're trying to add a specific column, it's in this case 1 row per game, and I want to create a column for whether the home team won, that would be at the row level. It's at the game level, and that's what our column is. It's looking at whether that game was won or not. However, if in this case I'm counting the number of games, that's something that would go across rows. That's an aggregation option. So sum, max, min, count, any of those, average, all of those would be examples of aggregation operations. And so that would be a good use case for a measure. So that's what I've done here is when I went over here and clicked on the triple dots, I said new measure instead of new column because this is an aggregation option. So we're going to choose for count, especially a field that I'm very sure is never null, and so we'll use home team in this case, and close parentheses with all your functions. This is true in Excel, this is true with SQL, a lot of platforms. When you have a function, there's an open parentheses, you list the arguments. In this case, there's only one argument, the field name, and then you close it off with another closed parentheses. And, honestly, you think about Power BI and how DAX works, it's object oriented in a sense. It's very similar to how both R and Python work. Left side, name of the variable. Right side, definition of the variable. In between, an equal sign. Variable object name equals definition. It's so simple, right? That's how Power BI works, that's how Python works, and that's how R works. And so that's kind of neat. I'm going to go ahead and press enter, or I can press a check mark, and now you can see over here this icon that shows that we've got a measure for number of games. All right, well, let's bring this into some kind of a visualization here. I'll do a bar chart here just because it's in the top left. And then I'm going to drag in number of games. I'll make that my x-axis. All right, we can see we have almost 50,000 games here. I'll go ahead and add some data labels. A lot of executives like data labels. We can increase the size of that if we want to. Let's see, value. You can see it's kind of aggregating at 43K. We may or may not want that. If we didn't want that, we would just change the display units to none instead of auto. Now, I love comma separators. Anyone who's worked on my team in the past knows that I'm kind of a stickler for comma separators. I just think they help to have the comma every 3 digits essentially. So if you wanted to format this at all or change the data type at all, you just click on that particular measure or particular column, then this menu comes up and measure tools, and I click on this to display with the commas as thousands of separators. And what you'll notice is now there's a comma there. All right, and it automatically adds a title here, number of games, just a few formatting things. From this is just my preference. Some people like the title left aligned. I kind of like it center aligned here. I'd probably make it a little bit bigger if the table were actually going to be this big. And I think number of games, we'll do number of games by home team. Now this is only going to count the number of home games. That's just the way the data set is set up, where if we bring in, which is what we're going to do here, to our y-axis here, we're going to bring in the home team. This is only going to count their home games. This would show that Alabama has more home games than any of the other conferences here. And you can see there a lot of them are about the same, right? You generally play about the same number of games in a season. I wonder if this basically means that Alabama's had more postseason games, because that can be a differentiator. There's some years where you might not have a postseason game. All right, so we've got this table here. Now, date functions. Let's get back to date functions. So we've got this table. Maybe we'll bring in some dates eventually. The date column we have here is a start date. Now this looks a little odd, where it actually has a sum sign next to it indicating that it's a numeric variable. So how do we change that? First thing I want to do is actually take a look at the table, and so I'm going to go from the report view to the table view over here on the left hand side. Okay, let's look at our date column. Here it is, start date. Okay, it's formatting it as Excel sometimes formatting it as a number, probably a number of days since maybe it's January 1st, 1900. Obviously not what we want here. So there's a few ways we could potentially change that. I'm going to highlight it here, and let's try just changing it right from this screen and going to the data type here. Again, whenever you select a column, you usually get these column tools or measure tools if you selected a measure. And we can just try changing it to a date and seeing what happens here. Looks like it might have worked. Yeah, we've got a season here that's 2003, and this is indeed a game in 2003. So that's a quick check. Everything seems to look in line. And we could do the same thing with last refreshed here probably as well. And turn that into a date type, and hopefully that'll look a little more user-friendly. Now, that's the date type. There's also this format here. we probably don't need to know the weekday, for instance. And so one of the things we can easily do, I like to use these short dates where it just is the month, the day, and then the 2-digit year. Just keeps it really concise. Yeah. All right, back to our report view. Now you can see it's actually structured as a date here, which is great. So let's write a column or create a measure against this using some date functions. So one of the things we might want to do, actually, let's just try this. Instead of doing kind of a horizontal bar chart, let's try the vertical bar chart here. And now instead of plotting by team here, let's bring in our start date, right? And this is just a good analytical principle here. All right, so it kind of sets it up here, split out by year and quarter and month, and you could maybe remove some of these if you really wanted to. I'm not a big fan of this format. Perhaps some find it useful, but when I bring in a date, pretty much the first thing I do is click on this drop-down arrow, and then I click Start Date. Okay, here we go. So now the only downside here, and you can see these are probably your, let's see, your winter, your spring, your summer, and then this is fall. So it's kind of interesting where you just don't have any games like for three seasons out of the year, pretty much. But this would be at the day level. It is, and you can see here, there's more and more games being added. I've looked into this in the past. That's one of those things where you want to kind of notice that and look into it. They've added more conferences into this data set over time. So that's why you're seeing more and more games here. Maybe they started adding Division 2 as well, starting around 2004, and then started adding Division 3 or 4, whatever the divisions are called after that. You can see it's much higher in the most recent year. So that's our data set, but it's really granular. If I wanted to say how many games there were in a particular month or season, it'd be really hard for me to do that because the data is so granular. So one way of accomplishing this is to create a month variable, and one way to do that is to create a month starting date field. And that's one example we can use of creating date functions, a really simple date function. So I'm going to create a new column. Why? Because a date is something that is going to be determined at the column level, at the game level in this case. This game occurred on a particular date, and now we just want to create another variable that represents the month associated with that date. So triple dots, this time I'm going to create new column. And then same formula before. Formula bar is going to come up here, and we'll call this month start date. Left side is the name of the variable, equals. Right side is the calculation of that variable, the definition of that variable. We're going to use a function this time, lots of DAX functions for all kinds of purposes. This one's going to be called date, and it takes in 3 arguments. And with most things, Excel, SQL, Power BI, DAX, arguments in a function are separated by commas. So this one takes in 3, and it gives us a hint right here. It shows us that it takes year, month, and day. So we're actually going to be nesting 2 different forms of date functions here. The first one is date, whose purpose is to take those 3 numbers. So the input is a number. A year is a number, the month needs to be a number, and the day needs to be a number. It'll take those and create a date for us. So I'll say year, and then I'm going to reference the start date, close parentheses, comma, month. So the year here, doing this, again, another function, open parentheses, close parentheses, and it's being applied to start date. This is a simple one where there's only one argument, which is a date. And it takes that date, which is in date format, and it extracts from it the year. So we want to preserve the year of the date in question, of the start date of this is the start date of the game. We want to preserve the year. We want to use the same year, and so we're just extracting the year part of that because our date function, the kind of the outer function here, this is called nesting functions, which can be done in Excel. If you've ever done an if statement within an if statement, you've nested functions. Same thing can happen in SQL. It's a really powerful tool to combine functions together to get the end result that you need for your business use case. So the first function, the first argument or input to the date function is the year, and we want it to be the same as the current start date. We don't want to change that. Same thing with the month, and so we're using the month function to get start date. And I'm just going to show you this for argument's sake. If I were to just go ahead and say, oh, well, I guess we should do the same thing for day and just pull the day out of the start date. Yes, we could do that. And now we need to close out the date function here. And then I'll press the check mark, or you can just press enter. Okay, so we create this, right? Because the last argument here was to just take the day, this basically just recreated the same thing as the start date. This variable will be the same as the start date. We took its year, its month, its day, we fed it to the date function, and it's going to be the exact same date as it was before, right? So there would be no need to do that. I'll just show you that that's the case. I'll bring it into this table here. Again, it tries to parse out the dates, but I just click on the name of the date here right away like I did before. It's the same thing, right? So why do we do this? Well, what we're going to do when we create a month start date variable is we take all the dates in, let's say, January, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, and we assign a 1 to all of them. We're getting the start of that month. So what that does, the purpose of giving them all the same value, if they're within that month year, is it aggregates them together. It groups them all together. And this is way too granular. This can happen in all kinds of analyses where you get way too granular and it's really hard to see the trend. And so what we're going to do here is we're still going to extract the year. We're going to use the month from the start date. But here, instead of selecting the day, which just ultimately ends up giving us the same date as we had before, we're going to put 1 in there. Okay, so watch what happens to our graph now. It's a little, you kind of saw, it's a little bit more aggregated now. It's still a lot of data. It's still kind of hard to see this. If maybe we could filter down to a year and see the difference. But perhaps the next step, again, it looks kind of odd here because we've got 3 seasons, 2 to 3 seasons out of the year where there's no games being played. So maybe our next step is, instead of grouping by month, I'll create another variable here, new measure, and we're just going to create the year. Now there is a season variable, which will be a little bit different than the year. Year here would be the year that the game was actually played, so those January bowl games are going to get associated with the next year and what we're about to do, versus the season would probably keep them the same. A game that occurred on January 1st, 2024 is going to be linked to the 2023 season if we use this. We've got a season variable here. So that's the difference here. In our example, that'll be linked to 2024. Now, again, this data set was refreshed as of a month ago. Probably won't have any 2024 records in it anyway. All right, so this is going to be, we're going to call this year. That'll be the name of our variable on the left side, equals, and we're going to use the year function, and we'll feed that at the same date we've been using, the start date, which is the date of the game. Let's see, it didn't come up there. Start. Okay, it's not coming up here. There could be a few reasons for that. I might have actually accidentally tried to create a measure, and so it's not even going to see that column at that level when I'm using a column level function like that. So let me go and do a new column. That might have been the issue. Okay, so this is going to be year equals year, open parentheses, start date. Yes, that's better. And then close parentheses. So I'm going to bring this variable into the visualization. I think it's going to look a lot better. Oh yeah, much, much better. So now we can really see a much more clear trend. The change in games over time. Again, a lot of this is due to new leagues being added to this API, this data set where the data came from over time. And then there were a lot of games canceled in 2020 due to the shutdowns. So you see that. Actually, if you take this data set further back, and we have a training around this, the Power BI training, I believe, uses all the data back to maybe even around 1930 or so when the AP poll started, so it goes way back there. You see another dip like this around World War II, and it's actually a gradual increase back. It doesn't all come back the next year. There's a year where it kind of goes down significantly. There's a lot fewer games played, and then the next year after that, maybe there were slightly more. It takes maybe a year or two to recover back to the normal amount of games played. So there were cancellations, and then they started to be less cancellations until things got back to normal. All right. Keep walking through this. This is a kind of a neat example here. We could do a lot with it. Again, I was talking to you about how they've added more and more conferences to this. So we actually have some, or I should say divisions. We actually have some variables over here, division. I'll just use the filter on all pages for now. So the way I think I found this was to kind of play around with this. Now there are some divisions where it's blank. There aren't too many cases like that. You can see, maybe 40 or 50 over time. And perhaps these are cases where the game was included because they were part of a division that was they were playing a division that was included, but they're part of a division that is not included in the API. That could be one reason why some of them are blank. Let me click on FBS. So that's considered to be Football Bowl Series. I'm not going to get that acronym right. These are populated pretty consistently. This is when this particular data set, we started to pull it from 1992 to present as of a month ago. Very consistent trend here. Now it is kind of interesting that the trends increased a little bit. Maybe there's been more and more teams added to the FBS over time. Perhaps that's what's going on there. But then let's look at another division like FCS. Clearly they started populating this in 2003, so that's a big reason why you see this jump in total games in 2003 is the API started adding FBS games. Now, what implications are there here? It's really important to know when your data started to be populated, and sometimes when it just comes to reality, a database might be populated starting on a particular date, and just a few records for whatever reason show up in that really early time period, and then it suddenly just pops, kind of like it does here, and all of a sudden you see like pretty regular volume. So if you were to just take the minimum date in a particular table and say, oh, I guess the table started in 1950, but then you were to really group by year or by month and say, no, back in 1950 there was one record there, and even in 1970 there was one record there. Really where we started to see a consistent amount of volume that was pretty similar across months was maybe it's 1980. And so then that's the date you kind of want to use for your analysis. Well, what's the implications of using all of your data? In this case, so we had FBS data going back to 1992, and then FCS, I'm not too familiar with all the terminology here, was added in 2003. Let's just say FCS is a lower division than FBS. I think that's true. What we might do is we might be building a model that says, what's the likelihood of this team winning a particular game? And maybe one of the features in our model is time, is what year was it? And what we might find is that the Division I teams were more likely to win a typical game because sometimes they play teams outside of their division. And it would find that the earlier the time is, or the lower the year is, the more likely they were to win. And you would think, why is a football team more likely to win when earlier on than it is today? And the real reason with that is it didn't have anything to do with time. It had to do with the fact that the records in your table changed over time. That later seasons included other teams from lower divisions that were more likely to lose when they played higher division teams. And so the definition of your data changed over time. So there's a couple approaches for that. One, maybe you can control for that in your model. You could have a variable for the conference, probably an indicator variable, since most models won't accept categorical variables. FBS, 1 or 0, 1 if they were FBS, 0 if not, so it kind of controls for that. If you know that that's the reason why your data is kind of the number of records is changing. And so once you control for that, time is probably not going to be a significant variable in a regression model anymore, because regression controls for all the other variables that you've included in the model. Another approach, the pro of that former approach is that you don't really lose any. You can still use pretty much all of your data that way. But another approach would be to say, well, I'm really just interested in, I actually am really interested in both conferences, and so I'm just going to start my analysis. I'm going to exclude any games before 2003. Now, you miss out on all that data. Maybe that data is less relevant anyway because it occurred a long time ago, and usually the more recent data is more representative of what happens next, so that might be a good approach. But you do lose, maybe there was some value to those early games as well, and they could give you more data points, which generally reduces variance, which generally increases the accuracy of your model. So excluding data, not always ideal, but perhaps, you say, oh, yeah, the data is really clean at this point, so we're going to use this data and onward. Or another approach would be to say, we're really just interested in Division 1 or the FBS games anyway. Let's exclude all the other rows outside of the FBS. So now we exclude those rows that were added, and so by the time we filter down to FBS, it is a consistent database. We've been tracking FBS games consistently back to 1992, so we can model on this filtered down data set, and we don't have to worry about the addition of other types of games and other types of conferences. So that's another way to handle this. So I just wanted to show you how I figure, I explored the data. That's kind of how I looked at it, and I flagged. That's very important. I applied a sanity check. Wait a minute, why would games increase so much in a given year? That seems odd. I think another thing maybe I did was to maybe group it by game and see that certain teams had much fewer, group it by team and see that certain teams had much fewer games than others. But you'll notice here, this is Division 2, it looks like. Seems to have been started to populate in 2021. They had a few games here. Perhaps these are the games where Division 2 teams were playing the FBS, and so that's why they were included earlier to that. Then you have some Division 3 teams, and it looks like those were started to be added in 2022. And so now the whole thing kind of makes sense. We've been populating FBS all along. FCS started to get populated in 2003, so our records double roughly. 2021, we add Division 2, and then 2022 and 2021, we add Division 2. 2022, we add Division 3, and so our records increase again. We can explain this data, and you want to be able to explain your data. That's really important. You never want to go into a meeting and say, well, I don't really know why it's increasing like that. It just is. I guess there's more games. I don't know. Executives expect you to look into this. Now, push comes to shove, maybe you proactively say, look, there's something off here. I don't know what's going on. I'm still exploring this. I'm talking to the database team that manages this. They're looking into the source systems. We're digging into this. Don't let your manager or your stakeholder be the one to call this out, right? That's going to look really bad. You want to have tried to look into this proactively. And again, maybe it's just exploring your data and like we did here, quickly realizing, oh yeah, if we filter on FBS, that's consistent. These other conferences have been added over time. All right. Well, sorry, we spent a lot of time there. Any other questions? Or Tiffany, did you want to look at any other type of time functions? We looked at the date function where you can build a date, and there's other forms of that in SQL and also Excel. And same thing with the year, month, day, where you can extract different parts of a day as well. There's every language seems to have a function that will take out parts of a date as well. And text too, right? Just that's helpful sometimes. Sometimes you need to extract just a part of a field. And in this case, the purpose of creating the year variable was to aggregate at a little higher level. And sometimes you need to aggregate at a little higher level to really find that deeper meaning in your data.